The photo arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, an ordinary Tuesday, one of those days when I was doing laundry and deciding what to cook for dinner. My sister's name appeared on the screen, a photo sent by mistake, meant for someone else entirely. Without thinking, I opened it, and in that moment, standing barefoot on my kitchen floor, my 8 years of marriage turned into a lie. A lie I hadn't even realized I was living. My husband was holding 2 newborn babies. The caption under the photo read, "Dad, I love you both." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I stood there, clutching my phone, and felt something inside me that had been silent forever erupt. My name is Nicole Young. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've believed that patience is a virtue that ultimately pays off. I'm a forensic accountant, which means I spend my days looking for small inconsistencies that people think are unnoticeable. A number that doesn't relate to a specific transaction, doesn't tell a meaningful story, but doesn't quite match the figures. I've built my career on trusting evidence rather than intuition. I never imagined I'd need those skills at home. Charles and I married when I was 30. He was ambitious, fun-loving, the kind of person who effortlessly brought life to a room. He was a partner in a logistics company that was just starting out, and I enjoyed watching him build it from the ground up. We talked about the family we'd have, how many children we'd have, what we'd name them, and whether we'd raise them in the city or move somewhere quieter. It seemed inevitable. We felt as though winter would descend upon us with the arrival of spring. It didn't come easily or last long. We tried for 2 years before we sought help. Then came the meetings, the tests, and the words that seemed like a second language. The IVF hormone injections are making my stomach ache. I hide under a loose shirt. We lost 3 pregnancies before the baby's heartbeat even appeared on the monitor. Each one was a personal tragedy, one I mostly bore alone, because Charles always recovered faster than me. I stay up at night doing mental calculations like I'm doing patient accounts. Where did I go wrong? What did I miss? What could I have done differently? I blamed my body. I blamed my stress, my job, the wine I drank the night before I found out I was pregnant. I blamed everything, not just the truth, because the truth was something I'd never experienced before. All the while, Charles held my hand in the waiting room and repeated the same things over and over again, promising that he would have to say it out loud to make it a reality. We will get through this together. I believe it. Just as you believe in the sunrise without any guarantee, because it is an unthinkable choice, without a doubt. My sister Emily was there too. Or at least that's how it seemed. She's 3 years older than me, always warm-hearted, always ready for a hug, a hot meal, or a phone call. She always told me she admired my strength. She always said she didn't know how I did it. It never occurred to me that admiration and envy could coexist in one face. The day the photo was taken, I had just finished a video call with a client, a dull afternoon that would come to dominate much of my life. I remember the light coming in through the kitchen window at a low angle, like it's late autumn. I remember the phone ringing twice. Then I remember looking down and seeing my husband's face. The same face that had told me 3 weeks earlier that we might need to try another round of treatment, that we shouldn't give up, was now looking at our 2 children as if they were the center of the universe. Then Emily called immediately. I left without saying a word. "Nicole," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't want you to know." I hung up. I didn't ask any questions. I didn't have to. 8 years of forensic training had taught me one thing above all else. Once you find the first discrepancy, you don't have to deal with the person who made it. You gather everything first. You verify the lie completely before reporting it. So, instead, I opened my laptop. I found the most famous family lawyer in town, Daniel Brooks, and booked an appointment as soon as possible. 2 days later, I was sitting across from him in an office that smelled of fresh coffee and fine paper, signing the first papers to begin divorce proceedings against my husband of 8 years. My hand didn't move. I remember being surprised by this. I didn't tell Charles. I didn't tell Emily that I knew. I went home that night and made dinner as if nothing had happened. Because for the first time in many years, I understood something perfectly. I wasn't the one who had to explain it. While my husband was celebrating the birth of his 2 children, with the woman he considered his sister, I was still 3 steps ahead of them, thinking I knew nothing. What I did next was something neither of them could have expected, calmly and without tears. The morning after I signed the papers, I woke up before dawn and did something I hadn't done in months. Instead of making coffee for 2, I made it for 1, and I felt no guilt about it. Charles had sent him a random text message the night before about a business trip. He was going to be out of town for a few days. I read it twice and then went to work. If there's one thing my career has taught me, it's that the people who are confident they won't be caught are the ones who take the hardest paths. They stop being cautious because they convince themselves they shouldn't. Charles spent 8 years building a reputation for being a devoted husband to me, and for facing infertility. That story needed maintenance, and those preoccupied with preserving one story rarely notice that they are leaving traces of another. I started with the credit card statements. We'd always kept separate accounts, a decision that seemed practical at the time, and now seems to have been the right one. But we had one joint account that we used for household expenses. After months of grocery and utility bills, I found 4 separate accounts for the same hotel in the same neighborhood, and we had no reason to visit any of them. 2 nights at a time, always the Thursday following the Friday. I checked the dates with my calendar, which automatically records everything on my phone, including location history. To be honest, I'd forgotten about the reservation. 3 of the hotel nights coincided perfectly with the weeks I was recovering from IVF treatments. A few weeks ago, Charles was working late at the office and needed to clear his head. I sat at the kitchen table with my computer open until about 2 a.m. Gradually, over the past 3 years, my marriage had become something I barely knew. Emily had told me more than once that she was the only one who could get Charles to his medical appointments, even though I couldn't get him to her. She would always say, "I'm just helping," as if it cost her nothing. I found records showing that those appointments were often scheduled on days when Charles didn't have any medical appointments. When I discovered the shared photo storage account, Charles had no idea I had access to a shared cloud folder that had been opened years ago. I wasn't surprised at the time. The photos were taken about 3 years ago. Emily was at her office holiday party, very close to the location. The beach is in the background, and it was a business trip away from the client's headquarters. They weren't entirely careless. They didn't think I'd notice. I want to be honest about something. There's a particular kind of pain you get when you're certain of a betrayal you suspected beforehand. It's different from the shock of discovering a betrayal you never expected. This was the second kind. And under the weight of the pain, something cold took shape. For 8 years, I considered every difficult time in our marriage to be my own failure. My body, my guilt, my sense of righteousness. But now I realize I was carrying the burden of someone else's choices. I didn't kiss Charles. I didn't call Emile again. Instead, I did everything I could. I filed a report. Every hotel complaint, every false pretext, every timed photograph told a more truthful story than any of them ever told me aloud. I prepared the file as if I were preparing evidence for a client, without comment. The facts didn't need my anger, they were self-evident. 2 days later, I sent the complete file to Daniel Brooks. I read it to him at our second meeting. His expression was enigmatic, as one would expect from someone who had experienced every kind of pain marriage can bring. When he finally raised his head, he simply said, "That's all." I told him I had 8 years of experience spotting things others missed. He didn't ask what I meant, and I didn't explain. 3 days after that meeting, my phone rang from a familiar number, but I didn't expect it to be Margaret, Charles's mother. We always shared a warm relationship, built on genuine love, not obligation. She used to call me often to ask about her work, and to tell me about her garden. I felt something different the moment I answered her call. Her voice was faint, trembling in a way I'd never heard before. She said, "Nicole," then fell silent for a long time, the only sound being her breath on the other end of the line. She was trying to calm her voice as she spoke again, sobbing. "Please don't tell him now," she said. I stood silently in my kitchen, where I had seen that picture a week earlier, and felt the earthquake again beneath what I thought I had fully understood. "Don't tell him anything, Margaret," I asked her. She didn't answer my question. She kept repeating those 4 words over and over, as if they were the only thing stopping her. Don't tell him. Don't tell him. And as I stood there, listening to my mother-in-law break down on the phone, it dawned on me that I was having an extramarital affair. But somehow, inexplicably, I had a growing feeling that I didn't know the truth. 2 days later, I met Margarita at the small cafe between our houses, a place we had frequented dozens of times over the years, always for a light, comfortable chat. This time, when she arrived, her hands were clasped so tightly around her head that the corners of her neck were pale, and she didn't raise her head until I pulled up a chair in front of her. She looked older than her actual age, not because of aging, but because of a certain heaviness, a weariness stemming from a burden that hadn't been lifted in a long time. Margaret was always quiet, a woman who wiped herself with a handkerchief and never raised her voice, even in argument. The woman sitting opposite me looked as if she hadn't slept in days. I need your help with something, she said before I even took off my coat. I should have told you 8 years ago. I've regretted my silence every single day since. I didn't say a word. In my line of work, I've learned that silence is often the quickest way to get someone to talk. Margaret took a deep breath and told me she'd known something that would change everything since the beginning of our marriage. She told me part of the truth, as people do when they're afraid that revealing it will make it an eternal truth. Does Emily know? I asked. It was a question that weighed heavily on me. I wasn't sure I could bear the answer. If my sister had known about my marriage for years and hadn't told anyone when she slept with my husband, Margaret shook her head firmly. No, Emily doesn't know anything about it. Neither does Charles. Her eyes met mine, and I felt something familiar in them. It was just me and one other person. Dr. Collins, your former doctor, and my stomach churned. Rebecca Collins had overseen virtually every step of our fertility treatment over the past 8 years, the tests, the procedures, the countless conversations about possibilities, options, and what came next. I haven't spoken to her in years, since we stopped treatment. We've been trying to adjust to the life we've had, not the life we planned. What does this have to do with anything? I asked her. Margaret's hands were trembling on her head. The test results came in just as you were doing your best. I saw it before Charles arrived. I shouldn't have. He happened to be home, was told about it, and opened it without thinking, as I usually do with letters. I paused for a moment, then she continued speaking in a low voice. This was strange. I sat still, waiting. I read the letter and immediately realized that Charles seeing it would cause him irreparable pain. That's when I made a decision. I called Dr. Collins directly and asked her, as a mother, to resolve the issue in my own way and at a time that suited me. She resisted my reservations because she's known our family for years and trusts me to act in everyone's best interest. Margaret looked up from the table. I hadn't done anyone any good. All I'd done was take away the pain and let it fester. She remembered all the things she'd already collected, the hotel bills, the flimsy excuses, the photographs that told a more truthful story than Charles's or Emily's. I thought I had fully grasped the extent of my marriage's failure when I entered into this conversation. As I sat across from Margaret, I realized I was seeing nothing but something old and strange. Margaret, I said cautiously, what does this report contain? She reached into her bag trembling and produced a small, crumpled piece of paper. She didn't describe the report itself, but rather a note she'd written to herself the day she read it. Perhaps it was something that would help her remember exactly what was said, if she'd had the courage to mention it. She didn't give it to me. She considered sending it to the world now too dangerous. She said, I can't talk about this here. Not like this, not even bit by bit. You really should have seen how I had to tell Charles 8 years ago, instead of telling myself I was hiding it in a drawer and waiting for him. Her voice broke. I braced myself for the shock. It was because I was the one who had destroyed it. I crossed the table and placed my hand on hers. I couldn't explain it, considering everything I knew she was hiding from us now. It was clear she'd been keeping a 10-year secret. I said I had to see that file. It was true that Dr. Collins had kept her records. Margaret nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her free hand. Then she said something that stuck with me that day, something I hadn't known when I'd suddenly returned home. "Those two children changed everything," Nicole said quietly. But not for the reason Charles thought. She'd called a doctor. The next morning, before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee, I went to Rebecca Collins' office. I hadn't spoken to her in almost 5 years, since the last round of therapy had failed. When Charles and I had quietly agreed to stop trying and allow ourselves to grieve for the family we'd lost. Her hospitality had helped me through this much faster than I'd expected, and Dr. Collins picked up the phone. Her voice quickly took on a cautious tone. "Nicole," she said. "It's been a long time," I said. "I need to go through my old file. Everything, every scan, every result from the year we were in therapy together." I stayed on the line long enough to hear the faint hum of the clinic in the background. Margaret approached me and asked, "May I ask you what happened?" I paused for a moment. "Come this afternoon," she said. "I'll handle everything myself." The clinic looked exactly as I remembered it. The same smooth gray walls. The same watercolors designed to make the shocking news seem otherworldly. Dr. Collins found me in her office, not the examination room. A large file awaited her on her desk. She was in her 50s then, with mostly dark silver hair, as I had last sat across from her, but her demeanor was equally composed, refusing to sugarcoat reality into anything more than a comfortable one. She said, "Before I say this, I want you to know that I've regretted my role in this case for years. Margaret came to me in a moment of desperate need, and I made a decision I'll never repeat. I allowed a mother's fear to override her patient's right to her results." She gave me the file. "I'm sorry, Nicole, and I'm truly glad." I opened it with a firmer hand than I expected, given what I found. Inside were pages I recognized: hormone charts, ultrasound notes, and a summary of 8 years of work. But near the end, I found a report I had never seen before, written 8 years earlier, and written especially for me, Charles. I read the medical terminology, slowly translating it in my mind, much as I used to translate financial statements for confused clients, until the meaning became obscure. The results didn't concern me at all, they concerned Charles alone. The report showed clearly and precisely that the problem we had been suffering from for years wasn't in my body, as I had believed for a decade. Given the strong influence of the male factor, Dr. Collins suggested that the couple discuss alternative ways of proceeding in writing. The letter arrived at home addressed to Charles. Instead of opening it and giving it to her son, Margaret, alone and in her panic, decided to shield him from the reality that she believed he might not survive. I sat in that quiet office for 8 years, paralyzed by self-doubt, feeling as though I were transforming into something else entirely. Every night I mentally tallied my mistakes. I accepted my body as the cause of all our suffering. I would whisper to Charles in the darkness, forgiving him for not being able to give him what he wanted. None of this was for me at first. "Why didn't you tell him?" I asked. Dr. Collins answered me gently, even though he knew what the answer would be. Margaret loved her son deeply, like some mothers, and protecting him was more important than the truth. She convinced herself that if he hadn't known, she would never have hurt him. I don't think she's considering the heavy price they'll ultimately pay. I remembered Amelia, then saw a comment on a photo of Charles holding 2 newborn babies and calling her Dad, without hesitation. If my earlier report is correct, and I have no reason to doubt it, then these 2 children are not his biological son. This meant that Emily either didn't know the truth herself, or that she knew something more complicated than just a love affair. I didn't say any of this aloud. I asked Dr. Collins to give me a copy of everything, and she spread the new pages out on her desk without hesitation, as if she were finally allowed to do her job properly after 8 years. I didn't meet with Charles that day. I didn't call Emile. I didn't call Margaret right away, even though I knew she would answer one way or another once she finally told me. Instead, I went home and sat in my car for a long time, the file on the passenger seat next to me. I remembered every image I'd held of my marriage over the years. The hopeful one, the heartbroken one, the one I'd lived through these past 2 weeks. None of them were entirely true. And now, I carried the piece that changed the meaning of other things. When I finally called Margaret that night, my voice was surprisingly calm. I told her I had the file. I knew what she would say. She remained silent on the other lines for a long time, and when she finally spoke, I felt a relief from her exhaustion, as if the burden she had carried alone for 8 years had been partially lifted. Now I understand why your mother was afraid. From the moment she first saw these 2 children? I said. I didn't hear from Charles for 2 weeks after I filed the paperwork. He stayed with Emily wherever she went, playing the role of family with 2 children who still had a secret to tell. I finished the 2 weeks I had begun quietly, meeting with Daniel Brooks twice, sorting out the financial records, contemplating ending the marriage, and leaving with a secret that would eventually come to light for reasons beyond my control. Contrary to what I initially thought, I hadn't spoken to Emily. I still didn't know what she meant by it, and frankly, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Some betrayals are so petty that they can only be healed by intense anger. This was a beginning. I was still trying to fully understand myself. It was Margaret who called me on Thursday night, her voice a mixture of fear and anxiety. She said, "Hey," after clearing her throat. "Ping. Charles is coming home tonight. He wants me to see the children properly. Wait, he's bringing Emily with him." I knew immediately what he meant, and what he wanted from her. "Margaret, you shouldn't do anything you're not ready for. I've kept it a secret for 8 years," Nicole said softly. "I think it's time to stop." I wasn't there when it happened, but Margaret told me everything that followed in detail, as if I were standing right there at the door. Charles arrived first and entered with absolute confidence, as he did in every room he entered. The confidence of someone who never doubted his entitlement to anything good. Emily followed him, carrying a child in each arm, her face reflecting a delicate mixture of forgiveness and pride. Margaret later told me that Emily looked tired, as new mothers often do, but less so than one feels when one finally finds what one has been waiting for. Charles left his bag by the door and turned to his mother with a look Margaret said she would never forget. He looked open and hopeful, with an almost childlike gaze, the look of a man about to deliver the happiest news of his life to his mother. "Mum," he said, pointing at the twins. Emily carefully lifted them from their car seats. "You're finally a grandmother." Margaret said that a hush fell over the room after that. She looked at their tiny faces and felt an overwhelming joy fill her heart. Throughout all these years, she spent sleepless nights clinging to this idea, convincing herself that she was silently awaiting her child. But the moment she saw these 2 babies in her son's arms, everything crumbled. She said she felt blood rush to her face. Her legs went weak, and she had to grab onto the back of a chair to be able to stand. Charles immediately noticed that her smile had turned to confusion. "Mother, what's wrong?" She opened her mouth, and the words that came out weren't the ones she had practiced thousands of times over the past 8 years. They came out smaller, more disjointed than she had intended, but ultimately she was searching for something real. "Wait," she whispered. He didn't speak. Charles was silent. Emily, who stood behind him holding a baby in her arms, was rather enigmatic. Margaret said she immediately felt that Emily was telling her something important that she hadn't known. What Margaret was about to say was new to both of them, for different reasons and in different ways. "Tell me what?" Charles asked. The shock was cautious, as if the ground were shaking beneath him. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She told me she had stood there for a long time, watching her son and the woman with whom he had built a secret family. She told me she felt the weight of 8 whole years in that strange, unbearable silence. She said she had been thinking about me for years, blaming my body, and apologizing for things I was never responsible for. She said this realization finally gave her the courage to take action. According to Margaret, no one had spoken about it for what seemed like an eternity. Emily cradled the baby in her arms, her face a mixture of fear and confusion, unrelated to any judgment. Charles, still in his coat, stood by the door as he waited in the hallway for the answer his mother couldn't give him. Margaret told me that she finally turned and went into the study. Kneeling before the small fireproof safe she had kept at the back of the wardrobe for 8 years without saying a word. She would open it when she was ready, though she wondered if that day would ever come. She said her hands were trembling as she used the combination. Charles followed her halfway down the corridor, stopped at the studio door, and his mother knelt on the floor in front of a safe he had never seen before. Emily stood at a distance, holding one of the twins, her face showing confusion and, as Margaret had said, something akin to fear. There was a sealed envelope in the safe, slightly worn at the edges, a testament to the 8 years it had been touched, examined, and returned to its secret place. Margarita held the envelope in both hands, as if she were holding something that had once been broken and could break again once opened. She turned her baby's envelope over and placed it against her chest, and for the first time in 8 years, she was ready to reveal everything inside. Margaret carried the envelope into the living room and placed it on the coffee table in the center. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her fingers from it, as if she were making a special effort to release something she had long awaited. Charles stood on it for a moment without touching it. Margaret later told me she had seen people preparing themselves before entering the cold water. "What's this?" he asked quietly. "Sit down," Margaret said. "Please," he said. Emily sat on the edge of the sofa opposite him, still holding one of the twins on her shoulder, the baby scratching softly in the tense atmosphere of the room. Margaret opened the envelope herself, carefully running her fingers over the folded and unfolded paper that had been creased and frayed many times over the years, and spreading its contents out onto the table page by page, the first lab results, and a letter from the doctor. Colin's letter, along with a handwritten note Margaret had added years earlier, was sent directly to Charles the week she received the first letter. Charles received the medical report first. Margaret watched his eyes move slowly across the pages, then quickly, then slowly again, trying to decipher the language, which wasn't overly complex, but was clearly reorganizing something fundamental to his understanding of the last 8 years of his life. That is, when did it all begin? He stopped. He looked up from his mother. "It's about me," Margaret replied calmly. "Yes, this is Nicole's file, not mine." His voice was strangely dry when Margaret said that, as if she'd never heard it from him before. "You're telling me she's not the reason we can't have children?" Margaret shook her head, unable to speak because of the lump in her throat. Charles placed the newspaper down with exaggerated care, his strength suddenly failing him. 8 years? He said. 8 years. I made her believe it was her fault. She kept asking me for forgiveness, Mother. She was always crying and apologizing, and I just let her. His voice trembled at the last word, because he didn't know what to say. Emily walked quietly around the room, the baby still on her shoulder. Margaret said something had changed in Emily's face as her body began to unravel. If the report was true, if the gynecological examination 8 years earlier was accurate and unresolved, then these children in her arms, conceived with Charles during their relationship, might not share his biological makeup. The same circumstances that made pregnancy impossible for me would make it impossible for her too. What does that mean? Charles asked Emily cautiously. She didn't answer. He was still looking at his mother, a sharp, angry glare in his eyes. You know, he said, you've known this for 8 years, and you make me believe it. He couldn't finish his sentence. Suddenly he stood up, clutching the paper, and, lost in thought, began moving the living room as if his body needed to be moved. I was trying to protect you, Margaret said haltingly. I know this isn't proof. I know how much it cost me, both of you. I've hated myself every single day since. What did you expect me to be? Charles's voice was heard for the first time. From reality. From a piece of paper. You let me watch my wife blame herself for 8 years. You let me watch my mother, thinking her body shames us, go through trials and losses and everything, always trying to remember physically, pressing the heel of her hand against her forehead. Emily slowly rose and moved. The baby was on her hip. Charles, she said quietly this time, I want you to witness this with me. If what you say is true, then you too will not be able to complete the birth of these children. A heavy silence, unlike anything she had ever experienced, fell over the room. Margaret had played a part in the sudden realization that Charles had finally returned to Emily. That something had happened between them that had nothing to do with love, and that everything they had built together over the past 3 years had crumbled. The same shaky foundation upon which his marriage, which he had just destroyed, had crumbled. The extramarital affair, the secret, the children he had proudly presented as his own in less than 10 minutes. He thought none of it made any sense. He walked in through that door and glanced at the report, spread out on the coffee table, then at his mother, then at Emily holding a child who might not even be his. Margaret said his face bore what she described as an internal collapse. Not a physical one, but an internal one, as if he were watching a building crumble, while its outer walls remained standing. Finally, he said quietly, "I want to see Nicole." Margaret said, "Charles, I want to speak with her. Perhaps you should stop here first. Take a break." But he was already gone, grabbing the keys from the reception desk and opening the door before anyone could stop him. Margaret said she'd called him once, and the sound of his name had made her throat tighten, but he hadn't called back. She stood by the door and watched the car speed off the road, its taillights disappearing into the darkness of the street. What Charles didn't know as he drove to my house was that, after 8 years of hidden truths, doors that had been firmly shut were now open to him, never to be reopened, because he finally understood why they had to remain locked. Charles arrived at my house shortly after 9 o'clock that night. Before the car door opened, I saw lights on the living room wall, and in an eerie silence, I knew perfectly well the meaning of this visit. I didn't rush to the door. I folded the towel I was carrying, placed it on the table, and walked slowly. He looked different on my balcony than he had after 8 years of marriage, more relaxed in a way I'd never seen him before. His collar twisted. His eyes were red, as if he'd been shouting the whole time in the car. He was still holding the medical report, and it was now wrinkled from the tightness of his grip. He said, before I could fully open the door, "You know, Nicole, you know about the report." He gave it to me as evidence, as if he needed to prove something he already knew. "I found out about it 2 weeks ago," I said. Just as I'd found out about Emily. He shuddered at the mention of her name. "Nicole, I swear I didn't know anything." "I did know," I said, and I meant it. It was strange. Standing there on my balcony, looking at the remains of a man I realized hadn't borne the burden of guilt I'd been forced to carry alone for 8 years, I felt something more like sadness than anger toward him. My sadness wasn't enough to change my mind. It was enough to remember that he was living a lie built by others, even if he had built many of his own lies upon it. He asked me, "May I come in?" "Please, I just want to talk." But I let him in, not because I owed him anything, but because I wanted to end this conversation in my own privacy, whenever I wanted. He sat in the living room, where we had spent 8 years of holidays and quiet evenings, and told me how his mother had shown him the file. He told me how Emily had made a mistake when she realized the twins might not be his biological sons, and how the relationship he had so carefully built on trust had crumbled in 10 minutes. He spoke quickly, desperately quickly, as if he could explain it to me quickly, as if I could relive everything that had happened in Daniel Bruca's office. "I'm not asking you to forgive me, Emily," he said. "I'm not asking you to forgive me for this. I know I haven't been forgiven. But Nicole, if only my mother had told me the truth 8 years ago, none of this would have happened. You have to understand that it started with a lie that wasn't even mine. I simply ignored it. Over 8 years of marriage, and a career built on distinguishing between fact and fiction, I've learned that people reveal a lot when you let them talk about themselves to the end. I finally said, you're right. It wasn't your lie. Your mother made a decision she shouldn't have made, and she'll carry it with her for the rest of her life. To be honest with you, Charles, I think she understands more than we tell her." I paused. "But she's wrong about one thing. It didn't start with your mother's secret. It started the day she decided you had the right to go somewhere else, without telling me that everything the house lacked, my sister was suffering from." "I didn't know what to say," he said softly. "You endured so much, and you made me endure even more," I said. "For 8 years, you made me believe that I was the one who couldn't have a family, but you built one with someone else. The medical report doesn't lessen the pain, Charles, it only explains some of it. This doesn't negate your option to respond. He had no answer. I could see on his face that he finally accepted what I'd said. That shriek he gives when someone realizes the argument he's brewing up in the car. The whole trip wouldn't have been worth it if it had been said out loud. What's going on now? He asked, his voice quieter than I'd heard from him in years. Now, the divorce proceedings are moving forward, I said. He shook his head slowly, looking at the report in his hands, clutching it between his fingers. Nothing tonight will change that. Then I said, Emily, it doesn't worry me anymore. I knew it was true when I said it. Over the past 2 weeks, between the hotel bills, Margaret's story, and the calm medical language of an old medical file, I've stopped trying to figure out what happened to my sister. Whatever she and Charles built together, they must know what's left of it, in my absence as a listener. Charles left just before midnight. I stood by the window watching the car's taillights go out as they had come, and for the first time in 2 weeks I felt at peace, instead of waiting for something in my chest. Had clears his throat for 8 years, I'd measured my worth by a story that was never true. I realized then that the end of my marriage wasn't due to a photograph, infidelity, or even a secret buried in a medical file. It was time to stop waiting for someone to tell me the truth, and to find it myself. The final mediation session was scheduled for Thursday morning. 3 weeks after Charles sat in the living room, reading the report that changed everything he knew about our marriage. I remember dressing as if I were going to any important meeting, simple, comfortable, nothing that even hinted at how I wanted to look. I didn't do any extra strength training. Until then, I had been. Daniel Brooks met me outside the courthouse minutes before to discuss the final details one last time, even though there wasn't much left to discuss. The financial statements were complete. The terms of the agreement were generous, if not unfair, to Charles. I didn't ask for more than I deserved. I don't need to be punished with numbers. The truth has done more damage than any agreement could. Charles waited inside with his lawyer, and in some ways, he seemed less like the man I had married. Though I realized it wasn't so much the room, but the past 3 weeks. His mother's secret had haunted him for over a decade, and it had cost him the relationship he had built to replace our marriage. I heard from a mutual friend that Emily had left the state with the twins. She refused to stay in a place that reminded her only of an institution she didn't believe in. Charles didn't try to stop her, and I partially understood why. Some things are simply not worth pretending they can be fixed once they're completely broken. Charles tried one last time when he saw me at the table. Nicole, he said quietly before the ceremony began, I know I won't understand this, but I'm asking anyway. Is there another formula we can try again? I looked at him for a long time, then felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not sadness, but that calm you feel when you finish the last page of a book. You already know the ending. I didn't say anything. Not because I can't forgive Charles. I think that will happen with time. But forgiveness doesn't mean standing idly by. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, feeling something stir in his shoulder, as if part of him had been expecting to hear just that, while the other part hoped for something else. Then, the process itself began swiftly. Daniel had done his job perfectly, and there was nothing to object to. When the final signature was placed and the last document was submitted, and it was finally over, I stood outside the court in the morning light, feeling for the first time in 8 years that I wasn't entirely responsible for how someone else lived their life. Margaret called me that night. She didn't apologize directly. I think she understood better than anyone that you can't apologize and accept blame on the same day. She told me she was proud of how she'd handled everything, and that she hoped we'd find a way to get to know each other someday, even if Charles wasn't there. I told her I loved her very much. I meant it. Margaret's silence had cost us all dearly, but I'd seen her trying to make up for it in the past month, as best she could. It meant more to me than she could have imagined. I never saw Charles again after that day, except for a brief conversation about a document, and months later, after work, neither of us wanted any connection to anything. Eventually, I heard that he sold his stake in the logistics company and moved to another city, trying to build a new life far from the one he had completely destroyed in front of everyone he loved. But I didn't build my life on what I lost, but on what I learned. A year after the divorce was finalized, I used part of the settlement to start a small foundation. This foundation helps couples navigate the infertility treatment process with complete transparency, full access to their medical information, and the necessary support. I owe nothing to anyone. I don't mention anyone's name in particular. My story didn't need to be linked to him to be significant. It was enough that it existed. I think back on those 8 years, often not with bitterness, but with a strange sense of gratitude for the woman who ultimately guided me. I always thought I failed at what I loved. Now I know I didn't fail at anything. I trusted deceitful people who easily deserved it. I blamed myself for 8 years. I won't waste another day on this. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't hurting someone, but being unable to tolerate their lies anymore. If you've made it this far with me, I want you to think about what will happen to Nicole next. Do you think she let someone new into her life, or did she find everything she needed on her own? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let me know where you're watching the show tonight. I'd love to hear from you all. There are many more stories like this to come, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any. Let's continue this journey.